Good evening, I'm Adam Jasser. Could Russia recover the hundreds of billions of dollars frozen by the West since Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine? On the record, European officials say this is off the table. But in reality, unless the EU acts decisively to permanently seize the funds, the Trump administration may soon force their hand. In just a moment, we'll unpack this apparent impotence of Ukraine's allies with Sir William Browder, a former prominent investor in Russia turned anti-Putin campaigner, and Yulia Ziskina, his collaborator and legal expert on war reparations. But first, a short report.
After Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Western nations froze nearly $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held abroad as part of sanctions on Moscow. The majority, around $200 billion, is deposited in European institutions, chiefly Belgium's depository Euroclear. The European Union's sanctions regime is up for renewal in July, and there are growing concerns that Hungary will block their extension, which would allow Russia to automatically regain the funds. This could not only reinforce the struggling Russian economy, but could allow Moscow to avoid paying war reparations to Ukraine once a peace settlement is reached. Various estimates put the damages Ukraine has suffered at up to $500 billion. Support for confiscating the funds is growing among EU nations ahead of the July deadline, even among countries which were initially sceptical, such as France. Many argue that allowing Russia to claim the funds will be a strategic blunder.
If we truly want to show our support for Ukraine and defend our continent, Russia's frozen assets must be released for Ukraine's use. Tough times call for tough measures.
Some legal scholars have backed this position, arguing that countermeasures against a state violating international law like Russia can be justified under current legal frameworks. Others argue that confiscation would be illegal because the West is not formally at war with Russia. Staunchest opposition has come from Belgium, the home of Euroclear, which is a leading centre for clearing transactions between nations, a profitable business. Prime Minister Bart de Wever all but torpedoed progress on the issue at an EU Council in March.
We are not living in a world of fantasy. We're in the real world where if you take 200 billion euros from somebody, there will be consequences. The frozen and immobilized assets are not like Putin's little piggy bank that you can just break with a hammer and then take the money out and spend it on whatever you want.
With the new US administration dangling the lifting of sanctions on Russia as part of a peace settlement, the Europeans will soon need to decide whether they want to join Washington in letting Moscow off the hook.
Sir William, Yulia, thank you very much for joining On the Record.
Thank you for having us here.
So, Sir William, if I may start with you, you have successfully campaigned in the United States and in Europe to impose sanctions on Russian officials involved in the murder of your business partner, Sergei Magnitsky. It took a while and the war to convince everybody that this is the right path. Are you worried now that this resolve is being sacrificed by the desire for a quick fix by the US administration?
Well, in a certain way, the actions of the US accelerate, I think, the possibility and the probability that this $300 billion will be confiscated. And in very simple terms, the US is now very clearly and very overtly threatening to withdraw any future military aid for Ukraine. The US is responsible for about 40% of all military aid for Ukraine. At the same time, Ukraine and the rest of Europe and the UK and many other countries don't want Ukraine to fail. They don't want Ukraine to surrender. They don't want to then be the next countries on the front line. And so as Europe ponders, how do we carry on supporting Ukraine so Ukraine doesn't succumb to Russia, there's only two ways to get that money. It's either to increase taxes in Europe to pay for Ukrainian defense, or alternatively, and this is where we get back to the 300 billion, is to confiscate that money, confiscate the money that belongs to Vladimir Putin and use that money to pay for Ukraine's defense and reconstruction. And I think the financial necessity and the geopolitical and security concerns of Europe will push us a lot closer to that decision than we've been any time before now.
Right, but there is also the third, perhaps least attractive option, namely that Europe will neither freeze the assets, the Americans will walk away, and Ukraine will suffer and be in limbo.
Well, that is the fear. And of course, as you played in your introduction, the vote will take place in July on whether to renew those sanctions. It requires unanimity of all EU member states. We know that Hungary is a country that's friendly to Putin because of Viktor Orban. And so there is a very realistic possibility that Hungary will not be in unanimity with the rest of Europe, in which case then the money goes back to Russia. So I would say that here we are towards the end of April. The clock is ticking very loudly. And one of two things will happen, as you said, in the third possibility, which is that if the money goes back to Russia, Russia gets that money to fight Ukraine, to kill Ukrainians, and Ukraine doesn't have that money to fight back. And so it really is kind of a crisis moment, if you will, a crisis of leadership where that decision needs to be made, and it needs to be made soon. And of course, the Belgian president, or prime minister, I should say, he's not incorrect in the sense that he doesn't want to be left taking the money and then having to fight off Russia afterwards. It should be a joint European decision to do that. Belgium should be protected by the rest of Europe. Everybody should be in this fight together. And so it shouldn't be just his decision alone. It should be everybody's decision. And we're at this crisis moment, I would say.
Right. Yulia, as a lawyer, what advice would you give to the Belgian Prime Minister and all the other European leaders as they seem to be wavering?
Well, as a lawyer, first of all, the big picture is that there is a legal basis here. It is not, as the Belgian Prime Minister said, breaking Putin's piggy bank and using the money for whatever we want. That is fundamentally untrue. It's been 3 years since this topic and conversation first started. And in those 3 years, the world's top international lawyers and international practitioners from all over the world have established the legal basis. And the legal basis is justified under countermeasures, which is a doctrine that's well established in international law. It essentially says that if a country has committed such a grave breach and violation of international norms, that countries are justified in taking countermeasures such as transferring the frozen assets of that country on behalf of the victims into a fund to be used for compensation, for defense, for reconstruction, and for according to well-established legal guidelines. This is not arbitrary. The money is not going to be handed straight over to Ukraine. The proposal is to put it into a trust fund to keep it safe, to keep it away from Hungary's veto, and to eventually use it to save lives in Ukraine. Again, it's not arbitrary. If there was political will to do this, the law can be justified and found to do it.
Right. Well, if I were the devil's advocate, I would quote Professor Nicholas Malda, who you probably know very well from the US, who argues that should that happen, Europe would effectively confirm that it's at war with Russia. What would you say to that argument?
Well, no, I don't think that's necessarily, well, I mean, part of it, yes. Europe, whether or not they like to admit it, are at war with Russia. Russia is at war with Europe. There is cyber warfare. Europe is especially affected by the hundreds of thousands of refugees that are coming in from Ukraine into Europe. And under this legal basis of countermeasures, if a third-party country, such as a country in Europe, is affected in such a way, they are entitled to take those countermeasures on a third-party basis. So that's one of the bases. The other basis is that under international law, if an aggressor country like Russia has violated such a grave, committed such a grave breach of peremptory norms, it's said to affect the entire global community. And any country then has the right to take those countermeasures against it in defense of the victim country.
Right. So William, let's go back to the Trump effect, because paradoxically you said, given that America seems to be walking away from dealing with this issue, or at least it's trying to put some pressure on both Ukraine and possibly Putin, threatening to walk away. You're saying that this is going to consolidate the Europeans and make them more active rather than demoralize them? Is that your argument?
Well, I think that both can be true. I'm surely everybody is demoralized. I'm demoralized. Everybody I know in Europe is demoralized. I was at Munich at the Munich Security Conference when J.D. Vance gave the speech, basically really telling Europe that you're on your own type of thing. So we can all be demoralized, but at the same time, it's a very sharp kick up the backside, where the United States is saying, we're not going to be doing this anymore. And there's an expression that necessity is the mother of invention. And here we are, first demoralized, and then second, realizing that we can either be sort of, crying in our own hands, or we can be doing something about it. And I think we are doing something about it. I mean, putting the seized assets to one side for a second, you can look at what the decision taken by Friedrich Merz, the incoming chancellor, where he's basically bypassed all rules to set up a €1 trillion fund to invest in defense. The same thing, similar with Keir Starmer, who's on very shaky financial grounds with his budget, who's going from 2% of GDP to 2.5% to 3% for defense expenditures. It's clear to me that the actions of America and the words of America have forced the European leaders to look very carefully and try to figure out how we can defend ourselves. And of course, coming back now to the 300 billion, we don't have to do it all with our own money. We can do it with the Russians' money. The Russians can pay partially for the Ukrainians to defend themselves against a Russian attack. And that is, it's just so simple and so morally logical that Putin can't can't launch an unprovoked invasion of a neighboring country, do $500 billion worth of damage, and then say, oh, but all of my money should be protected by the rule of law, even though I violated every law in invading a neighboring country. That just doesn't work. In this case.
Yes, there seems to be a pattern of Putin using the rule of law as an excuse for violating rule of law. But I just wanted to ask you about something else, because you mentioned Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister. Do you believe Britain is in a position to lead the way on this particular issue? Do you see any evidence that Britain is prepared to do that?
Well, it's interesting. So if we go back to Brexit, for most reasons, I would say 90% of Brexit was terrible for Britain. And of course, I didn't support Brexit. But this is the one place where Brexit has actually been very helpful, because Britain is not straitjacketed by whatever the dysfunctions are in Europe. And so Britain has been leading so far in coordinating a non-American response to America's withdrawal from the Ukrainian table. And if you remember, Keir Starmer was the one who organized the Coalition of the Willing in London. And just this week, there's going to be a conference among various members to talk about this proposed ceasefire by the Americans. So,
well, unfortunately, it was just cancelled, Sir William. It was just cancelled. Just cancelled because the Americans said they would not come, and then it was postponed in the diplomatic speak. But it seems, and we heard J.D. Vance saying, unless there is a quick movement from both Ukraine and Russia, we're just walking away and leaving, quote unquote, you all with this mess. So again, I'm asking, what if the scenario of America walking away actually materializes? Can Britain provide the leadership, in your opinion? Is there any evidence of that?
Well, I don't think that Britain can be the sole leader in a situation like that. I think that there's a lot of important countries, including Poland, that will be leading in this story. I think that it requires a very robust response from the most active responders, and that's the UK, France, Germany, Poland, and anyone else who's ready to show up. I'm quite certain that if the U.S. pulls out, we're not going to all just say, well, we give up. That's just not going to be the answer to the whole thing.
Right.
We provide 60% of the aid to Ukraine. We're going to figure out how to fill in the gaps, and we're going to figure out with the Ukrainians, what they can survive with, and they will survive. There's no question. Everybody thought the Ukrainians would lose in 3 days when the war started. They didn't, and they're not going to lose now, even with American withdrawal. It's going to be a lot more painful. More people will die. It's going to become a lot more expensive. But at the end of the day, we have a lot riding on this. It's not just Ukraine, but it's the rest of Europe, and of course Poland, very close to the front line.
Right. Yulia, I have another legal question to you. Is there a legal precedent in history for seizing these Russian assets?
First of all, yes, there is. There are several, actually, but the most applicable one, I would say, is in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. This was widely recognized by the international community as a grave breach of peremptory norms. And countries, including the US, France, the UK, led the way in seizing and transferring Iraq's frozen assets into the Bank of England, where afterwards this money was used to fund the UN Compensation Commission to compensate the victims of Iraq's aggression in Kuwait. So that is a very similar precedent. An argument can be made that it's not exactly the same. And yes, that's true, because in that case, the UN Compensation Commission was created through the UN Security Council. But what is the problem here? Well, we don't have the UN Security Council because the aggressor sits on it. But this is the importance of countermeasures. Countermeasures are specifically designed for situations where international institutions that are centralized like this have failed. And let's be honest, they have failed here. So under countermeasures, countries can take these measures outside of the UN Security Council. The UN actually passed a resolution in the UN General Assembly in November 2022, recognizing that Russia violated these rules of international law and must bear the responsibility of compensating Ukraine. This was passed by a majority of states under a mechanism called Uniting for Peace, which is used when the UN Security Council is blocked. So exactly for situations like this.
Right.
But the bigger picture, I would say, is what happens in history often is that we simply don't have an exact blueprint. These are unprecedented times that we are living in, and that calls for equal unprecedented measures to be taken to combat what Russia is doing, which frankly we haven't seen since World War II. So we have to adapt. And the reality is that we are setting a precedent for the future, whether that's through the actions that we take or also the inactions that we take. And I would argue that that is a far worse precedent to set if we don't take action now and we let Russia off the hook.
Right. You're well plugged in Washington. I saw your testimony in Congress on these issues. In fact, I saw also opinion polls suggesting that there's a significant number of Americans, actually a plurality of Americans, who also believe that Russia should pay up and that Russia is the aggressor, contrary to what might come sometimes from the US administration. So, and today we had a comment from Nikki Haley, a Republican, former UN ambassador, and I quote, she said, "Rewarding an aggressor will only lead to more aggressive actions. Failing to stand up for democracies who are invaded will lead to more invasions of free countries. To reward Russia for bad behavior and punish Ukraine for fighting to defend itself would be a terrible injustice. America should know the difference between right and wrong and want to be on the right side of history." From your experience of dealing with various lawmakers, politicians in the United States, what's the mood in Washington about this?
Well, there is broad bipartisan support for making Russia pay and for transferring these assets into a compensation and a defense fund for Ukraine. That has never been a broadly contentious topic. For example, in the United States, we have what's called the Repo Act, which concretely and directly gives the president authority to seize and transfer Russia's frozen funds in the US into first a domestic fund and then later into an international fund. This was passed last year in April, almost to the same day as we are talking now, exactly a year ago. And this was passed by a broad majority in Congress.
Right,
and
but
almost
pardon me for interrupting you. How can you translate that support that you mentioned into action to force or to persuade the current administration to take a more robust stance, or is Congress now switched off and the administration can do whatever it wants? A reality check, please.
Of course. Unfortunately, Congress is not doing enough to pressure the administration, but it must. There has never been question about Congress's support for seizing Russia's assets, and right now this is the greatest source of support because Congress represents the people in the United States, and the people have very clearly spoken that we should be using the aggressor's own money and not that of U.S. taxpayers.
Right.
This is a very, very simple no-brainer, and if the administration must represent the interests of the people, and unfortunately we're not seeing it doing that currently.
Okay. Well, so William, finally, we hear President Trump and his envoy, Steve Witkoff, talking about lifting sanctions on Moscow and saying that perhaps, American businesses can return to Moscow. Unlike Mr. Witkoff, you actually did business in Russia. So what would you advise him and other people who think going back to business with Russia is possible?
My advice for any American thinking about doing business in Russia is stay as far away as possible. I was the largest foreign investor in Russia. I was expelled from the country. I was declared a threat to national security. My offices were raided. They seized my documents. My lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who investigated it, discovered that they used the documents in a fraud. He exposed the fraud, and he was subsequently arrested, tortured for 358 days, and murdered on November 16, 2009. They've since been chasing me around the world with Interpol arrest warrants, extradition requests, kidnapping threats, etc. It's a complete, lawless, dangerous, physically dangerous, financially dangerous country. And this has all happened before there was any invasion, before the invasion of Georgia, before the invasion of Ukraine, before the taking of Crimea, before the full-scale invasion in 2022. It's an insanity to do business in Russia. It amazes me that these guys are running around touting this as a good idea.
So William, Yulia, thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was On the Record. Thank you very much for watching. See you next week.